Good evening, everyone. Yes, it is evening now. I'm Rex Ellis, and I serve as the Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. B.A. Botkin, Benjamin Botkin, was an American folklorist and scholar. He was educated at Harvard and Columbia Universities. He was editor of a small magazine called Folk Say. Contributors to the magazine, which was popular between the time of 1929 and 1932, when David was just a boy, included Carl Sandburg, Langston Hughes, Louise Pound, Elaine Locke, and Sterling Brown, to name just a few. In 1938, he became the editor and chairman of the Federal Writers Project. From 1942 to 1945, he headed the Archive of American Folk Song at the Library of Congress and also served as president of the American Folklore Society. At 1939, at a writers' conference in 1939, he explained his view of what writers had to gain from folklore. He believed, as I do, that writers should utilize folklore because it has the power to make the inarticulate articulate. And above all, it lets the people speak in their own voice and tell their own story. Curators of the exhibit on slavery and freedom at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, you know them by now, Nancy Burkall and Mary Elliott. I think they agree with Dr. Botkin and suggest that the through line of understanding the significance of global slavery is through the crucible of understanding the importance of power and profit as juxtaposed to the human cost. That every aspect of the global trade, the massive power and wealth that saved countries, that buttressed nations, that formed complex societies, must be seen in relation to the massive collateral damage that such opulence, such power, such profit wrought on the minds and the bodies of the enslaved. Scholars and literary writers such as B.A. Botkin and Sterling Brown and Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes and Paul Laurence Dunbar, James Weldon Johnson have understood that a major piece of our historical pie is acknowledging the cultural expressions and experiences of those who were captured, enslaved, bought, sold, tortured, traumatized, and what they had to say as well as what they did in response to that trauma. But in spite of the fact that slavery is one of the most written about topics on the planet, this one topic continues to escape us. Somewhere in our search for truth, we are not careful, we will miss the significance, the complexity, the chaos, and the fragility of the struggles that some survived and others were consumed by as they literally live on the fringes of human existence. Well, enter Daniel Black. He is so dedicated and has dedicated much of his stellar work to expanding our understanding of that human experience as it relates to the Middle Passage. His award-winning novel is called The Coming. It's an extraordinary novel that grabs you and shakes you and horrifies you and leaves you toe up from the floor up, as your senses and your psyche are bombarded with words and his images. PBS has identified 10 authors they say everyone should read. Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, Amiri Baraka, Octavia Butler, W.B. Du Bois, Ralph Ellison, Alex Haley, Langston Hughes, who was influenced by Paul Laurence Dunbar and Carl Sandburg and Walt Whitman, Zora Neale Hurston, Richard Wright, and Toni Morrison. They missed so many. J. California Cooper, Alice Walker, Gloria Naylor, Lorraine Hansberry, Conti Cullen, Chinua Achebe, Wally Soyinka, Frederick Douglass, James Weldon Johnson, and so many more. You know, I would argue that the emergence of Daniel Black and his ability to capture in writing and in spoken word the experience of the Middle Passage in this instance breaks new ground in the tradition of Langston Hughes and Chinua Achebe and is eminently worthy of our attention and our respect as we continue our journey to fully immerse ourselves in the power, the profit, and the human cost of global slavery. I was at a conference some years back that was held at the same time in Los Angeles that O.J. was taking a ride in his famous white Bronco. It was a conference that brought together literary artists, musicians, scholars, and historians in the same room to discuss their work. As they began to plan their day, they asked that the scholars and historians initially meet in one room and the artists and musicians meet in another. Bernice Reagan, musician, historian, creator of Sweet Honey in the Rock, as well as an excellent historian, without hesitation went into the room with the scholars and the historians. As she found a seat to sit down, one of them commented, "Bernice, you shouldn't be here, you should be in the other room." She responded, "I am right where I need to be." If you know anything about Bernice, you know that was the end of the conversation. And she told me that story later. She said, "Don't let anyone pigeonhole you into thinking you are not worthy because you don't fit. Don't let their narrow-mindedness be your burden." I suspect Daniel Black may sympathize with her point. Professor Daniel Black is a native of Kansas City, Kansas, spent the majority of his childhood years in Blackwell, Arkansas. His PhD in African American Studies is from Temple University. He is a full professor at Clark Atlanta University, where his heart's desire is to inspire young Black minds to believe in themselves, to provide an example to young Americans of the importance of self-knowledge. He has a communal commitment to writing literature that celebrates the African American presence in America and inspires the world to be more human. Hear ye him.
And then came the disaster. With open arms, we embraced those who looked nothing like us, assuming that all life honors life, but we were wrong. In the end, we fed and strengthened our own captors. We cannot claim naivete. We cannot say we were people undeveloped. We cannot say there were no signs. We can say only that we did not heed them. Sound wisdom was as common to us as the evening breeze. We scoffed and shrugged at elders' forewarning of a time of great tragedy and chaos. We did not believe them. We had learned to ignore our own gods, to take their goodness for granted, to believe that because of them, we were immune to external attack. So we did not hear them. We heard only what we sought to hear, but now we hear it all, echoing in our regretful memories. If only we could have seen into the future, we might have avoided the onslaught. But most of us had no such powers. The few who did, the seers and sages, we dismissed. They were always speaking of things to come, always warning of impending disasters that rarely came to pass, at least in our lifetime. Now we know that prophecies come to one generation but materialize in another. If only we had listened, if only we had had more disciplined ears, but we did not. And so we blamed ourselves. We blamed our gods. We blamed each other. But there was no one to blame, only shame to bear. And pity, yes, great pity, that a people so strong missed so many clues. The forest whispered it, the birds chirped it, the trees waved it, the antelope danced it, the tall grass swayed it, the lions roared it, the elders said it over and over. Beware! Seek not the thing you do not need. Greed destroys wisdom. Let just enough be enough. We were too blessed. Our abundance suggested immortality, so we stopped searching for invisible things. Our mothers had worked so hard, we didn't have to. Our fathers had killed enough game, their sons hardly knew the hunt. We didn't know then what we know now. A life of leisure destroys a child. When there's nothing to work for, there's nothing to gain, nothing to die for. So we had to die that we might live again. And that's what we did. We died. By the thousands and hundreds of thousands, we died. We'd never seen such unjustifiable violence. Bloody bodies laying prostrate across the earth as if pleading for forgiveness. Those who survived did not mourn. There was no time. The loss was too great. We still have not mourned. We still have no time. We remember, yes, but we have not mourned. And so death came quickly. It came unannounced. It came cloaked in our own garb. Death came white as clouds, smiling as if it loved us. It came in the darkness of night while we were laughing and talking with ancestors. Death came in legions with guns and ammunition too powerful to battle. Death came like the monsoon winds. It came like a flood. It came with earth-shaking force we could not control. It came under the authority of nations we did not know. It came with men whose absent wives benefited from their husbands' despicable behavior. It came with men whose children would one day inherit their father's legacy of violence and wealth ill-gained. Death came to strip the land of its glory. It came to thousands and hundreds of thousands without sympathy for our loss. It came with impaled brutality. Death came to scatter children's blood-soaked bodies about the earth, thus fertilizing dry, yearning soil. But in the end, death came simply to teach us that we were brothers. And now we know. But this was our coming. Some were taken by surprise. Some were killed on the spot. Some were taken in their sleep. Some were ambushed in the forest. Some were tricked into believing they were going for a walk. Some were consumed with hatred. Some were inebriated. Some were too lazy to fight. Some were busy settling communal affairs. Some were nursing wounds inflicted by spouses. Some were telling children bedtime stories of talking spiders. Some were beating drums to warn others. Most were not listening. When the drums fell silent, it was too late. Our destruction was complete. An entire village razed in one solitary cycle of the sun and moon. They destroyed our homes and forced our leaving. They bound us with chains of heavy iron. Elders rendered mute and lifeless. Babies deprived of life's knowing. All we could do was wonder. We did not speak. There was nothing to say. In those moments, we heard our elders' warnings and we understood. We knew they loved us now far more than we understood before. But they could not hear our cries, our pleas of lament, not with the ears of the living. And so one by one, by one, by one, they took us away. They took the farmers first. Those who knew the land, the earth, the ingredients of the soil. Those who heard its rumble, felt its movement, understood its seasons. They took them first. Those who knew seeds and germination, plant spacing and harvest. Those who walked barefoot upon the soil in homage to its life-sustaining power. They took them first. It was no accident. They would farm again in a new world, feeding a nation committed to their degradation. And after the farmers, they took the healers. They were not hard to find. Most days, the healers lingered about the village, repairing bodies and minds too troubled to heal alone. They must have known that if they took their healers, they would destroy a people. They must have known. They must have known. And they were right. So they captured our healers that we might not rebound. Villages of frightened, wounded people without medicine men and women would take centuries to restore. But they knew this. They had studied us. They had lived with us. We had welcomed them. In one solitary day, our pride deteriorated into fractured, deep-seated insecurities. And after the healers, they took the Jali that our stories might not be told. And after them, the warriors that our collective strength might be divided. And after them, the artists who told us we were beautiful. They chained and muted orators and teachers to stop the flow of inspiration and to abort the belief that we were gods. This was all so devastating. But this was our coming. On the 26th day on ship, our humming began at a cool, even pace when beats were slow and lulling. A man below deck purred a dark melody, then repeated it. It wasn't a groan from pain and desolation, but deliberate lines of constructed meter and time that jarred our spirits and invited our participation. He did it again. And looked at us and nodded. And so we, one by one, joined in. Some in the upper registers, some in the depths of the voice, having found a language that needed no words. We hummed until we knew we'd survived. We hummed until we released mothers and fathers whom we knew we'd never see again. We hummed until our love for and gratitude to each other was made clear. We hummed a celebration for living. We hummed a celebration for fighting, for refusing to die. Yes, refusing to die, because dying would have been so much easier. For still believing against all odds that we'd get home someday. We hummed our commitment to raise children wherever we went in the way of our people. We hummed that our women slightly above us might know we hadn't forgotten them. Yes, we were separated, but we were not divided. We hummed for the dead lying next to us. We hummed for children not yet born. We hummed for children born but left behind. We hummed. That was all we knew to do, was to hum. Our tongue was stranger to the next one's tongue, and so we hummed. We hummed for kinsmen, yesterday's enemies, who we thought we hated, but who were now the key to our survival. We hummed for days. We didn't know how long or how many moments it would be, but we knew that as long as we hummed, we would survive, we would live, and that was our commitment alone, simply to live. It was also devastating, but this was our coming. Thank you.
Before this young man leaves, why don't you introduce him?
Yes. This is my good friend and brother, the magnificent CD. Give him a hand. Thank you. I would love to tell you that we've been doing this for years and years and years, but actually I met him a few moments ago, right?
Congratulations on this book.
Wow, yes, sir.
Congratulations. Now you have 7 other books, or this, including this one, there are 7. But this one is unique, a unique departure in terms of your work. Tell me something about how this one came to you.
Well, I remember sitting in my house contemplating the death of Trayvon Martin, the death of Michael Brown, and all these deaths. And I remember asking myself, what was the ancestral message in this? What was the ancestral point? of these tragedies. And it simply came to me that we had disconnected ourselves from our own memory, and that these deaths had come to remind us, right, of the power and the potential and the transformative nature of loss. I was really in the middle of another book, a different novel, and when this one began to speak itself, if you will, into my consciousness. And I've been studying the Middle Passage for some 15 or 20 years. As an academic endeavor, I had no intention of writing a novel about the Middle Passage. In fact, I was quite angry when this began because it was such an emotionally intense endeavor. But I think that once I finished, I really believe that we're in a moment now when we have to reconstruct the history for our own people, and especially for young people coming after us. And I'm hopeful that this book begins to do that reconstruction.
Now, you have done something unique with this book in terms of not just writing it, but also saying it. So tell me something about that decision to do that, and then how, not only how it has evolved in terms of your performing it, but what's the reaction been?
Well, the first thing I think that's important is, up until writing this book, I had always heard, of course, that slaves came from Africa. I had always heard that, there was human cargo. But I always wondered, we didn't know any of these people's names, right? And I think what has contributed unto our own as African people and other people's too, inability to really understand African people as human, is we have been very comfortable with the lack of humanity on these Africans transported across the waters. We have not needed their humanity. We have in our hearts and in our consciousness, we have called them cargo, right, and left it at that. We never asked what their dream was. We never asked what one's relationship was to the other. We never said, I know his name, that one who you threw overboard, I know his name. And I realized that there's something wrong when a people cannot dream the name of their own ancestors. And so in this book, every African on this ship I name. And I think that's very important because that's been one of the things that people have told me is one of the strengths of this book. It said they didn't know that they brought Kwesi and Abubakar and Dumi and Atiba and Agbona and Beketembe and Shamba and Olurimi and Azizi and Chitope and Naja and Dumani. They didn't know they brought Usman and Yoro and Chukwudi. I had never heard anybody suggest that these African people actually had names. And so I think the notion of fighting my way to make sure that this was the story of human beings, not just the story of cargo transported across the ocean. I think that's one thing. The other thing is the reception has been absolutely enormous. And in fact, I have to admit, it's been a little shocking because I'm thinking everybody's heard of the Middle Passage. Sure, you've heard of the Middle Passage. But I don't think that's what the, if you will, allure of this book has been. I think to let those on the Middle Passage tell the story. Every person who speaks in this book is below deck. And they tell what happens day by day by day. They fight among themselves below deck. They weep, they cry, they die. They are fully human being in every sense of the word. And for us to see that, I think is a very, very, very important thing historically.
When I heard the djembe for the first time, the sound of it transported me to another place. I can't tell you where it transported me to, but it was to another place. And I wondered what it is you wanted the djembe to do in terms of setting up the presentation.
The djembe for me is the heartbeat. And I want us to be clear that yes, many Africans died, absolutely, but many more lived. And in living, there is responsibility. And that responsibility is passed unto us. And so every time they slap the drum, for me, that is another heart that has survived. That's another child that has come into the world, who is now the dream and the hope. I always love that line in James Weldon Johnson's very voice in saying, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. That that there were those, yes, who died, but they died dreaming a future. They died dreaming a people. And we are the dream of those who never could imagine this moment. And so being in this moment now, I'm totally and absolutely excited to honor and to give homage unto those who imagined my entire existence before I was ever conceived. I believe that.
So your students at Clark Atlanta, have they been exposed to this?
They have. My students said that the book was awesome and extraordinary, but it's hell to take an exam on a book by the author, you know. They said, how in the world can you give us an exam on this book, right? And they discovered that. But but the thing that's been wonderful, which I have to admit I had missed, is the unbelievable pride these black kids have at a black school that my own teacher is the author of the text. That's commonplace in most other places, right? That is not commonplace at historically black institutions. And so they asked if we could read it. In fact, it wasn't even on the syllabus, but when it first came out. And so I said, sure, why not? You're in my class, why not? And I remember coming into class on a Monday, and when I walked in, they just stood up and began to clap. And they just wouldn't stop. And they just clapped until I wept. And one young man said, Dr. Black, I'm not a reader. I know I'm not supposed to say that because I'm in college. He said, but I'm not a reader. But I read this entire book nonstop. And he just stared at me. I said, brother, you have been transformed then. So it's really been quite an amazing, amazing journey.
I was talking to Mr. Holston. I don't think he's here now. He was the artist who did the mechanics,
Yes,
the
sir.
exhibition. And as I was talking to him, I asked him, what was it like doing the painting? And he said, it was some days torture, it was some days, joy. He said, I went through the gamut of emotions. He said it was a very, very hard thing to do. I know what it felt like for me to actually read the book itself. And yeah, it's something you don't want to put down. And then you do want to put it down because it's kind of rough,
Yes, sir.
And,
Yes, sir.
and then you pick it up again and you go through it again. So for me, it was a roller coaster ride of emotions. What was it like for you to write it?
Oh my God. Every other day or so, I created this ritual to kind of center myself and get myself kind of back to stability. I would go into my front yard and lie on the grass, like just literally lie on the earth, that the earth could kind of still me and bring me back, to center. Because there were days that I wept so vehemently that I literally thought I was not going to be able to finish this book. It was that emotionally taxing. But of course, it must be. Even when you said it took you on a roller coaster, the middle passage was a roller coaster. And I think it would be absolutely insulting to try to figure out how to make this story palatable. I think it's supposed to be precisely what it is, because the healing is in the hurt. The healing is in the pain. The healing is in the recognition that if a people survive this, really, truly, those are unstoppable people. But if we're not careful, the descendants of those who survived this have been so consumed with the legacy of those who were above deck that their own inheritance, right, has been missed. And so this was, if you will, speaking from below deck. And it was very, very, very emotionally difficult. It really, truly, truly was. In fact, people have asked, is there a part two? I said, you don't mean that. You don't mean that. You just, but certainly a worthwhile venture, for sure.
Tell me about the research that you connected to in order to create this story and such a realistic story.
Sure. My God. Journal after journal after slave narrative after captor journal, the papers of Alexander Falconbridge. There was a great book that helped me, Marcus Rydecker, The Slave Ship. I read everything that I could get my hands on concerning Middle Passage, even what might be the potential effects of enslavement on the ecology of the ocean itself. Right? Like, what does it mean to pour this kind of energy into this living organism called this ocean? How did that affect the very body? So I read for years and years and years, again, thinking I was going to do an academic text. And so once this began to come to me, I had done much of the research, but one of the things I also did very painstakingly was I studied naming and naming traditions from every group of people from whom enslaved individuals were taken, just so I could know just even possibly what a young sister's name might be, what a brother's name might be. I wanted those names to ring in my consciousness, and I wanted to offer that up to a literary space that it might be able to speak and make its way into this text. And so I think...
So it sounds like there was some changing that took place during the process of writing the book, for you.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, initially, I had written, it was about half this length, and I sent this book to my editor, and I said, listen, the book is done. I'm done, right? And she read it, she said, oh no, you can't be done. You can't be done. I said, ma'am, I'm done. Either I'm going to another book, And my editor convinced me, she said, go back. I just think there's more in this story. And so I went back, and it just kept coming. And I really wanted it to end because it was just so painfully difficult to write. But what I realized about 3/4 of the way is that I owed the sharing of that pain with these people. That was a price I owed. And it was a gift to be given this narrative. Right? And so in giving that narrative, being given this narrative, I had to share in the suffering in order to really understand the real gift of what it meant to be given this story. And so now I've been trying to figure out how to read from it and be unmoved. I've already written it, world, you can have it. But I haven't figured it out yet. The minute I began, it gets right there in my throat, and I can barely take it.
The sense of the spirit that you write about, you don't write about, you write about faith, but there is otherworldliness about the dimensions of faith that you suggest and you mention. I'm assuming that's deliberate.
Yes,
but what did you want to say? But because there is an abiding sense of faith and hope and even optimism in some of that suffering.
Yes, sir.
So help me understand how that faith and how that spirit, the sense of spirit, you think in some way influenced that need to, or that desire to, or that strength to, or that courage to go on when everybody around you day to day, they're gone,
right.
And they're no more. And these were relationships that you developed along the way, but they still continue. The resilience is still there.
Yes.
Say something for me about that faith and that spirituality that,
yes,
you mentioned, please.
Yes, I think the first thing that I'll say is that what was most troublesome for me about this novel is that when it came to me, Africans had absolutely no blame that they were laying at the feet of Europeans. They were absolutely unconcerned with what Europeans had, if you will, enacted upon them as a people. Their entire obsession was, we weren't paying attention. There's one line that I like that says, we spoke more proverbs than we chose to live. If we had had our ear to the earth, we would have heard their footsteps. In other words, they hold themselves responsible, because from that context, what they're really saying is, if this happened, there must be a purpose greater than what we can imagine here. And so the question of fault actually is a dead end question. The question really is, what is the utility of the spreading of black bodies around the universe? That's the question they're really asking on this ship. And it really caught me off guard, because, I was prepared to do my critique, what I mean, as a writer. But they kept asking, what is the cosmos asking of us? what's the mission God is sending us on? And did God have to force us? We wouldn't go voluntarily, you know. And so this whole question of faith, I argue, and I argue this academically, that really black theology starts during the Middle Passage, right? James Cone becomes, if you will, kind of the formal articulator. But I think black theology, the notion of God, what are you doing? God makes sense of this absurdity. Help us to understand how, in fact, we are on this ship, literally in the same boat together, literally. And then we're supposed to go to a new world and make a new place. All right, but what Africans never do is say, God, you're not real. You don't exist. What Africans do say is, God, this doesn't make sense to me. Help this. And so this whole struggle with the notion of how spirituality and how spirit and how the notions of God shift drastically just during this era known as the Middle Passage, I think is the birth of this thing we call black theology. This notion that, yes, God is real, absolutely. Yes, God is potent. God is omnipresent, yes, yes, yes. But God, some of your ways trip me out, right? But I'm still with you. That's a powerful thing. It's a powerful thing. It's a powerful
Well, the other powerful thing for me was you didn't spend a great deal of time blaming Europeans and blaming the white man for what was going on, even though it was something that you could have done throughout the book. It was almost as if you wanted them to work, you wanted the working out of their own humanity to be their own doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As I told one, I went to a white book club, a book club of whites, some weeks ago, and I walked in and they had read the book and said, oh my God, we love this book. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, right? And I said, oh, no, this is your story, right? And they froze. I said, there are more of you on this ship than me. You're just in another place. So for you to pass this story off to me, right, as if this story belongs to me, absolutely erases the responsibility you have of accounting for the ways in which you are absolutely responsible for the transplantation of millions of people. You have to understand you were on this boat with me. Now the question is, what inheritance do you get from this boat? What were your folks doing? What sense does that make to you? What theology do you get out of that? You know? And so we had this awesome conversation. Yeah.
In Arkansas?
No, sir. No, sir. This is Atlanta.
Why don't we let the audience get into this? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your performance and your sharing
and
your offering of that. Performance studies scholar Rebecca Schneider here talks about how performance remains, right? And how there are material and immaterial remains of performance, and Black performance knows that in so many different ways. I'm interested also though, in the ephemeral opportunities of performance in museum spaces. We were talking earlier today about critical oral histories, right? And the need to kind of verify and challenge memory. But performance does that in a different way. And I'm interested in what does ephemerality have to offer the museum and through performance. And then also this larger challenge of challenging contested histories. How does ephemeral performance challenge that?
Me first?
You first.
Okay. I think the way I answer that is to say, I think that performance studies have opened a vast inquiry into this question of the way in which our bodies move in this space and the way in which that movement interacts, right, with our geographical space. The thing I think we need more of, though, is the power of ritual, right? And I think when you start talking about African spaces and African-centered spaces, I think we need to do more ritual performance, right? Such that, see, ritual is not as easily contained, it's not as easily controlled. But the whole point of ritual is that ritual will teach you as you're trying to be taught, right? As you're trying to teach. Ritual invites the invisible. Ritual invites spirit, right, into a place where we may not be able to control what spirit will say, right? And I think that's very important, because I think even in reading this book, I think I'm always inviting ritual, which is to say, I'm always inviting spirit to say something more, something beyond what I have conceived or conceptualized, right? And so I think this whole notion of ephemerality is built into that, because I think to make a thing that powerful, I think we have to, if we're going to study African people, we also have to conceptualize the way African people understood the place of the invisible as a very, very real thing, intangible, but no less real. And we have to understand that that is a requirement in the study of African people.
Thinking about theater or performance in the theater, in the museum, is very challenging. Unless you have a giant audio-visual aid like Colonial Williamsburg, to do it in the legitimate theater usually is done through public programming. I prefer to think of the power of story in a museum setting. As they were talking in the last session about multiculturalism and multi-historicalism, or whatever the concept was, I began to think about, and they asked Paul the question about the sort of harsh stories. It made me think about Emmett Till. We had a discussion in the museum about whether or not we were going to collect his casket. And then we had another discussion about how we were going to communicate that to the media. The answer was, we were not. We had that casket a good 3-4 years before we let anybody know we had it. Because the story was so palpable, the story was so powerful, and the story was so important, we did not want anyone to disrespect it, and we did not want to contribute to its being disrespected. So we held that one. 60 Minutes tried to leak it, but we held that one. We wanted that to be the debut when the museum opened its doors on September 24th. And we were successful at doing that. On that segregation floor where we have the train and we have the Angola Guard Tower, the train, there are lines that go from that train all the way around to the other end of that gallery, which is where the Emmett Till exhibit is. There are people who wait in line to hear and to see and to experience that space, because the story is so powerful and the story is so palpable. So for me, how we bring those objects to life, how we make them real, is by in some way talking about Money, Mississippi, and talking about 1955, and talking about that fan that they tied around his neck, and then throwing him in the Tallahatchie River, thinking that the fan was going to float down and he was never going to raise again. But the buoyaness raised him up, and when they did what they saw, she said, Mamie Till Mobley said, they got to see what I'm seeing. And that casket and the motivation that that casket gave to civil rights workers who said, if they did that to Emmett, then they can do it to me. Right. And I'm going to stand up and I'm going to make, Simeon Wright, who, and then I'm going to shut up, Simeon Wright, who was the cousin who happened to be in the room with Emmett while he was asleep. And when they came up on that second floor to get Emmett, Simeon was in that room. They told him, you go on back to sleep. They took him back down. They took him to the truck, and the wife of one of the abductors was in there. And he asked her, this is what Simeon, his testimony, asked her, is this the boy? She said, yes. That's the last time Simeon Wright saw Emmett alive. And when we got that casket, and we went to the Church of God in Christ in Chicago to sort of do a little ceremony, Simeon Wright stood up and he said, "Now that I know that casket is in the Smithsonian and that his story will be told for generations to come, I can die in peace." See, for me, that's not performative. That's real. That's a story. And it's a story that is real and palpable. And what makes it so important is that it is real. That's the kind of storytelling that I think is important for we got over 3,000 objects in that museum, in those exhibitions. Every last one of them have a story. And the more we tell those stories, the more we enliven and bring to life not just the museum, but those items, those stories. They are nothing without the stories that accompany them. There was another question. Yes.
I want to start by thanking you both. This is beautiful. It's moving from the introduction to the sound, to the reading, to the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question about process, Daniel, and it has two parts. The first is that it sounds as though the story came to you, and so I wonder if at any point and at what point then you thought about audience and who you were writing the story for. And I also have a question about revision. It sounds as if this was really difficult and painful to actually get on the page. So then how do you go back to that page and revise and revise and revise?
And I revised to death. In fact, I'll start with that one. I'm sure I did 10 drafts of this, which is why I was so painful, because I was just revisiting this, over and over. But I wanted the rhythm of the words to do what I imagined the water was doing on the ocean itself. Right. I was trying to make the words have this poetic lulling kind of effect, right? Because I've been trying to force the reader onto the ship, right? So that you don't get the option as an American to read this and to be distant from it. You must take this journey, right? And that was very, very difficult because sometimes I was even counting syllables, right? So then that word doesn't work, And so I would have to wrestle to find a word that fit a certain rhythmic structure, right? And so I did all of that. So the revision was insane. The question of process, this book absolutely came to me. Again, I was 200 pages into another book, and I began to hear these voices in my head saying it was the coming, and I was like, okay, something's wrong with me. Something is really wrong with me, And so I called an elder mentor of mine, and he said, no, listen, there's something else is going on. Put the other book down for just a day or two and just see what happens. And then this book began to birth itself. But I was still in the middle of the other book, which I wanted to finish, right? So I wrote the other one in the morning, and for the most part, I wrote this one at night, right? But the nighttime helped because I was trying to get that whole visceral experience, of what it meant to be in the dark. So I would sit in my living room and turn off all the lights except the light on my computer, right? And I would sit on the couch with my feet up because I was trying to be on a plank, and I had the laptop in my lap. And it was really, I would literally weep if I talked about it too much. It was more than anything I could possibly tell you. So in this case, I really feel like it was a gift sent. And I'm just really, really humbled that the ancestors sent it through me. Yeah.
Yes. Hold on, Paul.
I again am very moved by the presentation, and I was struck by a comment that you said just a few minutes back, that I'm writing from below deck. And immediately my mind went to Ralph Ellison, But who but for the lower frequencies I speak for you.
Absolutely.
Butchered the quote.
Absolutely.
But so I'm wondering, you spoke about your reading of narratives, your reading of historical materials, Falconbridge, do you also, what placement did you have for African American literature on the Middle Passage, or Robert Hayden, others, or just in general, thinking about that that Ellison quote?
Sure. Well, ironically, that's actually my PhD area. I was a big fan, and am a big fan of Charles Johnson's Middle Passage. I'm a big fan of an African writer named Ayikwe Arma, who wrote a book called 2000 Seasons, which talks about the great displacement of an entire continent of people, et cetera, et cetera. And certainly, I'm an Ellison fan. And so lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of literature. But again, I hadn't planned to write this at this time, right? So when it came to me, I said, oh no, what are we doing here? What is this about to be? But I actually do African American literature. In fact, that's what I teach, right? And so the connections between this text and so many other texts is certainly not lost on me. It's certainly not lost. In fact, when I finished this manuscript, my publisher said, do you know Charles Johnson? I said, I don't know. Who knows Charles Johnson personally? I said, no, but is there a way we can get to him? And so to make a long story short, I sent Charles Johnson an email just with my fingers crossed. And he said, oh my God, you love the Middle Passage. It's great. He sent me this email back like in 10 minutes. Okay? And I said, I've written a manuscript, and I'd love if you might glance. I know you don't blur, but if you might just glance and tell me what you think. So I sent it to him, and maybe 3 or 4 days later, around midnight Atlanta time, I got this call from this unknown number, and it was him. He said, Daniel, it is 4 o'clock in Seattle, and I just finished this book. And I have never been so disturbed in all my living days, right? And of course, I was half asleep, but I'm awake now, you know. And so the thing he said, you know, I wrote the Middle Passage, and I'm very proud of it, et cetera. He said, but I think there's something you do that we've all been waiting for, and that is this notion of allowing the ancestors to be the only speakers in their own story. And he went on and on and on, and I said, listen, I'm appreciative. He said, if there's anything I can do to help you, let me know. I said, I have a list, you know. So he's been very, very helpful. But all of that to say that I think this fits into the canon of African American literature, and has roots in many other literary spaces for sure.
Hi. My question actually goes back to what Ariel was asking, because one of the things I like about your amazing presentation, 2 things actually. One is this thing, I'm interested in hope, and how might we think the Black experience as a space to study what it means to hope beyond where hope is not possible. But the second one is about the question of the imagination. And Saidia Hartman, I think it was at a Yale conference where she spoke about the importance of thinking about the imaginative archive as an archive where there is no archive, where history doesn't necessarily help us in any kind of factual way. And so what do you think is the importance of that imagination to be able to write the history of the Black experience in both in the slavery, during slavery, but in its afterlife?
Yes, sir. I think that as enslaved as our bodies have been, so has our imagination. I think we have literally, as a people, been bound by the conceptual possibilities of our own bondage. Like many people have even asked, they said, how did you know what their names were? Which is it's a question of imagination. I said, of course I didn't know what their names were, but I could imagine what their names were. But why wouldn't we assume that we could know the names of our own people? You know, if you know what I'm saying? If you just think about it, you know, if I think of 16th century England, I know what their names were. That's not difficult. Yeah, I mean, you understand what I'm saying? Then all of a sudden we get to Africans and I don't have the slightest idea You said that is imaginative bondage. And so our job is to set ourselves free, right? To be able to conceive of possibilities that this enslaved colonialist mind never gave us permission to do, right? And even needing permission is more bondage, you know? And so one of the things I do in this text is, there's a love affair between two characters named Abutu and Chisanganda, right? And they love each other. Oh my God, they are so in love, right? And so many people say, oh my God, I'm so glad you included a love story in this, right? Again, you can't imagine that they captured two human beings who actually loved each other. It's unimaginable to us that they actually captured two people in love. But that's because we've been talking about cargo. We've not been talking about human beings. So the first stretch of imagination we have to do is to consider the possibility that we were fully human before we ever arrived in this place. And that we've stayed human the entire time, right? So I think that you kind of got me wound up, so I forgot the first part of your question.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
It's fine. But then,
Okay, brother.
But
All right.
I just, because I wanted to tie back, because then one could say that performance is a part of that. Imaginative.
Sure,
Right.
sure,
So, yeah.
sure. I think the thing that's tricky though is, I wanted no one though to be able to dismiss any of this because it's fiction. You know, oh, you made that up. You know, how real is it? So one of the things I did very painstakingly is there is no fact in this book for which I did not have a historical source, right? But it was painstaking, like the rape of men happens in this book.
Yes.
Right? There are several young men whom these captors find comely, find beautiful, and they become these bed partners for these captors upstairs. And it's so unbelievably funny, man. Everywhere I go, people read and said, I know it happened. I know it happened. Well, why haven't we ever admitted that it happened? Why don't we ever talk about the fact that the rape of men also happened? Because somewhere our pride and our ego is beating us out. Somewhere I feel like we are still in this battle for not wanting to admit that we were even capturable, right? Which is another kind of conversation still, but okay.
I'm going to stop here, and we're going to set you free, and we're going to set him free. But before we set him free, let's let him know how much we appreciate what he did.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow, thank you all. Thank you.